Dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to episode 21 of Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. I'm Claire, and I'm here with Marsha. And this week, we're going to be talking about the TV series Last Light. It's a mini series on Amazon, based on a novel, but we are going to be talking mostly about the show today. Came out in a few years back now, just I think pre-pandemic. And Marsha's going to tell us what it's all about. So over to you.
Yes. So Last Light, it's basically the story's about this man, Andrew Yates. He's with his family and he gets called up by his big oil business and he's a scientist. He's this like molecular scientist, and they're like, something's wrong, you need to come check it out. He gets transported all the way to the Middle East to this like oil plant or something, and he discovers, oh my God, something's wrong with the oil. But then there's all this like government interference and a bit of a conspiracy, and like has someone caused, all of this like oil to start like degrading or whatever. We don't really know what's going on. He's trying to work it out, but at the same time avoiding, getting assassinated by this like secret group. Is crazy. And then we sort of see how like with the collapse of oil, like all of like the world's infrastructure starts breaking down, and cars stop working and borders start closing, and everyone's like, what's going on? And eventually we discover it's this sort of climate terrorist groups that's responsible, and they've contaminated the oil with this oil-eating bacteria that was originally created for oil spills by Andrew Yates's partner. He's like the leader, like his old bestie. And they had like made this like basically manifesto of how to like save the world from itself. And they spend maybe like 2 episodes trying to stop him, but like the climate activists are too smart. They're like slowing everyone down. They're wasting time. They kidnapped Andy's daughter. It's all exciting, and then at the end they basically win. And the oil, like there's the tip, they talk about the tipping point, which is obviously like an allegory to the actual tipping point of like climate change, but there's like the like point at which the oil is unsavable. You can't turn back, like you can't come back from the contamination. And they win, and technically like the bad guys, I'm saying in quotation marks for this right now, they win, but would they make a better world because of it? Which was, that's kind of, I think, a good synopsis. But
Yeah, it is.
yeah,
And especially I think that focus on this idea that I suppose it is unusual because, as you say, essentially the bad guys win, the
yeah. So
catastrophe, it happens. And there's a sort of 5 minute voiceover or whatever at the end telling us how it made a better world, but it's still unusual in terms of how it treats justification or not.
yeah. And well, we were talking about this because I was saying how I actually didn't think the show was very good.
No, so I have seen this show twice. I still like it. I appear to be in the
Really?
like 1% in the world.
Wait, so I don't. Okay, like okay. We should like. Do you want to talk about why you like it, and I'll talk about
um,
why
I
I
think I
don't like
liked it conceptually, probably
Okay.
overall. So
Yeah.
I think it does do something very interesting with the idea of really keeping us sort of in two minds about I guess the consequences of this action versus the means for getting there. Um, it has, I think, quite a lot about this idea of kind of the individual and the reliance on the kind of the hero figure, as it were, to save the day. And it also looks quite a lot at how you handle, I suppose, corporate power. And in this case, it's basically by taking out the well, it's a fake Saudi Arabia, but it's mostly filmed in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere in the Middle East. So, essentially, do you have to kind of like assassinate these leaders and then undermine the heart of the industry, essentially?
Yeah.
So I liked that, and yeah, there is a big kind of like, oh, when do you put your family first in times of disaster, and this
Yeah.
corporate working father who is always off doing things other than this rather than being there for his wife and his neglected teenage daughter and his blind son who is undergoing surgery. So
Oh my God.
it's a not necessarily brilliant on kind of convincing me about the sort of family relationships, but at the same time, this idea of kind of where responsibility lies about what one person does in terms of their work and things like that. And also, I guess there's some stuff about sort of ethics of scientific responsibility and things like that, when it turns out that Andy created this
Big twist,
hypothetical
yeah. Him
projects in the first place.
and
Him and
Carl, the leader of the climate terrorists.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were partners.
So,
yeah.
It's I think it's interesting. Maybe it's not executed as well as it might be. It packs quite a lot into 5 episodes. On the other hand, I quite like things that are like only 5 episodes rather than 500 episodes. Sometimes it's just so nice to
it'd be like one and done, you know.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
don't have to sit there for an extended number of weeks trying to get through it. I agree on a lot of your points. I think the like concept was really interesting. I really like, I feel in terms of like the story beats having the group that's painted to be the villains win at the end. It's like that doesn't happen. But then it not only them winning, but it also creating a better world and them like basically stating that at the end. But I just don't think it was like, as a show, I don't think it was very well written. Like I think there are points where I was like, why would this specific thing that's happened happen? Like, like especially the family relationships or some of the like decisions that. So there's like the side plot with Andy Yates's wife and son, and obviously sort of painting how the like breakdown of infrastructure affected them, and Sam is blind and stuff. So we're having like this discussion about how like it affects like disabled people and poor people more, except they're middle class, so they're not really poor. But there was times when Eleanor Yates, I think some of her decision making was just like, you're putting your son into more danger by being so. I think there were like parts where there's like this little subplot about her losing the antibiotics for her son's eyes because he was like mid-surgery when this sort of thing happened, and like it had to be stopped mid, like, or as they were preparing for him to go into surgery to like basically get his eyesight restored. Like, and the doctor was like given these like antibiotics, and then there was like the doctor also really liked Eleanor Yates. It was all a bit weird, and then he just died suddenly. I was like, what is going on? I was like, it was just like the classic. He gets hit by a car, he like steps out into the road, and it was honestly quite comical, to be honest, to watch. But she loses these antibiotics that like are meant to keep give him a hope of like getting the surgery to restore his eyesight. But she drops them and doesn't have them, and then she purposely puts herself in danger, and then inadvertently putting Sam in a position where he might get left on his own just to go and get these antibiotics. Like, he's already blind, and this is kind of like an emergency situation. And like at the end of the day, like I don't know, she could have lost her life or like gotten in trouble or got arrested and put him in more danger going forward. Like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not here to judge people's parental decisions and stuff, but I don't know. I feel like she got very like wrapped up. I can imagine there's like all the emotional stuff because I think in the show they say how like she put in like all the funding and stuff to get the research done or something.
She'd obviously spearheaded kind of like the research into the genetic condition that had left her son's eyesight to deteriorate into blindness, and so I guess she's highly invested. She's also, we're sort of told, has kind of taken a break from a fairly high powered career essentially to look after her son and to spearhead this in the context where her husband seems to be frequently absent, obviously kind of at the beck and call of his employers, and I guess that explains why she's grown so close to the lead doctor on the project, because she herself has been so involved in it. I agree, she's a relatively annoying character insofar as she's very she's not particularly great in a crisis and maybe does make some poor judgment calls. I mean, I'm not quite sure why in the circumstances they couldn't have stayed in France.
Yeah, like I don't
But
know why, like you know, she's gonna if we're gonna be fine, like your husband's gonna come get you like in a couple days,
yeah, I
like
guess there's the
whatever.
problem with all the communications, which
Yeah,
means
it's
that,
true.
like, everybody probably is in the dark somewhat. She's also Laura, her daughter, they can't contact her and they don't know what's going on. And although she's grown up, she's not that grown up, is she? I don't know. What age do we think Laura's supposed to be? She's sort of your age, I guess,
Yeah,
maybe.
my age probably.
Yeah.
But also, what was the subplot with the what was his name? The like Laura's boyfriend. What's his name? Owen
Owen.
Jones.
Mm,
Like he just disappears at the end. Like we don't know what happens to him. Like I know he was like trying. He was like kind of involved, was trying to protect Victor, but he didn't really know what he was getting
mm,
involved in. This is like he was basically with the guy who was stalking them and was like
mm.
part of the climate activists who were trying to kidnap Laura, Andy's
I
daughter.
guess we saw with Owen that he had been manipulated into working for this
Oh yeah, it was something about like
group.
financial, like his
Yeah,
study
because
study
he's
fees.
very much from a different background and is self-financing his studies and so on, and that this was a kind of a way to make money without fully realizing that he was being exploited, I think. But and he does try to make that right. But you're right. I suppose it's perhaps this is the disadvantage of something that is relatively short. He's kind of underdeveloped in terms of his kind of character in the background to where that comes in.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. But yeah,
but
I think overall for me, like it was just a painful like I don't know, like none of the dialogue felt like it was very natural. Like that sort of like in terms of it actually being a TV show and it being
mhm,
well made, I don't think it
mhm,
like came through for me on that account.
mhm,
But like I agree, like the concepts like themselves are really good. And plus, it was adapted from a book. There clearly was
mhm.
something to work with. But then
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
how can you mess up like this adaptation of this book if it's actually written out for you?
I don't know. Yeah, I suppose it's an interesting. I guess it's that balance, isn't it, between kind of the sort of the action elements. I mean, I felt that the sort of visual settings and things like that were quite good. So in like Paris under the sort of rioting and things like that, and I guess what it's this thing, isn't it, about sort of societal breakdown in the short term and how governments do and don't handle that and the lack of information along with, I guess, the actual kind of consequences of suddenly having no access to oil, or not knowing whether it's about not having access or whether this is temporary or whatever. I mean, I think you said that you didn't think that things would necessarily have been handled the way that they were handled in this kind of crisis. Do you want to say any more about that? Was it about the kind of the government handling or what?
I'm not sure. I was speaking to I was like going over my notes and speaking to my partner about them, and he was saying how it was like interesting. Like I was saying, in the show, all the borders closed and stuff, and there's like sort of, they didn't have like freedom movement because like even like the cars like stopped working,
Mm-hmm.
blocked up all the roads, like you can't actually drive down the motorways or whatever. And he was saying how like that's interesting that, how even like with climate change, there's probably going to be like almost that descent into like not yeah fascism in terms of like closing borders and stuff, like considering the fact that there's going to be all these like climate refugees,
Yeah.
people immigrating, and there's going to be tighter control on that anyway. And like I don't know, yeah, I actually can't remember why I said that to you. That must have been last week when I finished the
Yeah,
show.
it
I was
was.
like, I don't understand. I don't understand why they did this.
Yeah, I mean,
But
I
yeah,
I felt that I think there are likely things there. I mean, one of the things that struck me was the fact that I suppose that the reason that a government, and obviously we were seeing this from the perspective of mostly France, Britain, and the place that was not in fact Saudi Arabia, and so you're seeing a narrow perspective, but there was quite a lot of kind of, I guess, government silence, not really helping gain the people's trust. But I also think that this is exactly how a government might well behave, because they think it might reduce panic rather than sort of, let's just close the borders, stop the planes flying, rather than talking about the fact that like planes are literally falling out of the sky. And then there was sort of another side to that which struck me, which was the sort of lack of international cooperation.
Yes,
And
yeah.
that,
I guess is that the communications thing, but
I
they
guess that
clearly
would be
they could.
partly.
They had like one of those like satellite phones. What's a
Yeah. I
satellite
mean,
phone again? Sorry,
there
I
are
actually
ways
don't
of,
know
yeah,
what that
there
is.
are. So yeah, I mean, there are forms of communication, radio, sat phones, things like that yeah, continue to work. And obviously, like the networks were coming down, but that wasn't to say that there wouldn't be some networks running, because obviously not every form of power in 2019 or whatever and now is dependent on fossil fuels. So yeah, so I guess there's an issue with the communications, and there's probably an issue with countries feeling vulnerable because they don't know whether it's just happening to them, whether this is an attack from a like a foreign
Actually, they do have some
body.
communications because I remember them being like, "Oh, Russia's sharing information,"
Yeah,
or
yeah.
in the
So
show. But
yeah,
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
So maybe I'm so I just thought that when they're gathering together kind of scientists to try and create a virus that can consume the bacteria,
yeah,
um, it felt like it was quite a sort of small team
yeah.
in like kind of one place. But maybe that's because that would be the only thing that was possible, like small teams of whoever you could get in the particular
Yeah, I mean, it's
country
also
you're
like
in.
interesting. They had like 3 days to do it.
Mm,
Like it took them months to like work out how to do like the COVID vaccine and
mm.
stuff, and it's basically like the equivalent of
Yeah,
a COVID
it was
vaccine
always
for the
going to
little
be like
bacteria.
a long
It
shot.
wasn't gonna. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
Mm.
it was curious.
What do you
Yeah,
think about, if we take the sort of basic premise that a a good thing, the creation of a bacteria that could clear up oil spills, has been weaponized? What do you feel are the kind of the ethics around, I guess, the fact that this, they created this thing as these young idealistic graduate students or whatever, and clearly knew that it could be weaponized. That's why Andy and Carl go their separate ways, right? Because Andy doesn't think that it should be done, and Carl does. So is there responsibility lying with Andy for not, I guess, highlighting this fact and making sure that somebody had made a kind of virus or other kind of countermanding science that would overcome this? I mean,
yeah. So I got confused because I was like, is this bacteria already like commercialized? Is this something that it's used to? They were saying how it's made to clean up oil spills. Is it already used to clean up oil spills? Like if it's so like is it if it's frequently applied, like would they not have
mm,
measures to? But I
mm.
guess like probably Carl crazy science style edited some genes and there was like
Yeah, possibly. I
immune or
don't think it's
something.
clear whether it's actually being used, because I think that Andy does keep saying, it was only ever like a thought experiment, and see whether it could be done. And we had these kind of idealized views,
I
and
thought
so
that was
on.
about the specific
Yeah,
like destruction of like the oil industry and
yeah.
stuff
I
and
don't know.
I thought the like bacteria had already been created. I thought that was like part
Mm,
of their like
mm.
PhD project or something. I don't know. I
Yeah,
like I
yeah.
wasn't it was
But
kind of
I don't know
unclear.
whether it's an interesting one, because obviously from the perspective of having a tool to help with climate issues like oil spills, it would make a lot of sense. But as we've talked about before, the idea of commercializing something like that, creating it in it for a sort of, PhD or whatever is one thing. Creating it commercially is probably another. And I doubt you'd have a great deal of private investment, because as it is, it's cheaper for them just to leave their oil spills than it is
Yeah,
to.
maybe it's some sort of world where they're getting like fined for the oil spills. Like I don't know.
Wouldn't this be nice?
Yeah, it must
You're
be
hoping for
nice.
some, but I think you're being more optimistic
I
about the
don't know,
scenario.
well,
Maybe.
the water companies are getting cracked down on for all their like
That's
sewage
true,
spillage.
yeah,
So
but they haven't
maybe,
been for a long time, so I
yeah,
don't
true.
know.
I don't know. But it actually feels like the bacteria that I don't know why like that feels familiar to me. Like that's not something
Oh,
that actually
okay. Okay.
exists, is
I mean,
it? I'm not sure.
Not to my knowledge.
Not to
You
my
know
knowledge.
about bacteria.
But actually, funny enough, so Sam's surgery, where they're basically like, oh, I actually can't remember what they specifically described it as, but they're gonna replace
It
the
was,
photoreceptors in his eyes.
yeah, with using stem
That's
cell
like,
surgery, I think,
yeah,
isn't it? Yeah,
that's an actual thing. Like that's,
Oh,
yeah, I
cool.
work with someone who, if everyone listening right now, summer, August 2024, I'm at this internship where we're growing little mini brains in petri dishes called organoids. But there's another lab at the place that I'm working at who does the retinal organoids, so like eyes and stuff. And
Yeah.
that was the lab that proved, like, using mice retinal organoids, that they could like restore vision in mice. It's like an actual thing that's been proved,
Cool.
but I don't know. I don't think it's been put into practice like therapeutically and like clinically. I don't think it's actually gone through those stages yet. But that's like an actual thing that's happened.
Well,
So
there you go. Okay, right. So, I mean, it's certainly all of this is the sort of, it feels like the sort of positive innovation that science directed towards a better future could absolutely, bring about. And as I said, it comes down to this question about, who's funding that kind of thing, who's funding bacteria that eats oil when the power is all in the oil industry. But I mean, one of the things that obviously we see is this idea that Andy has, I suppose you might say, sort of sold out from his work as a young man, working and then moving towards kind of this high level corporate role, working within the fossil fuel industry. And I suspect that this is, it's a fairly kind of common trajectory, especially since he's somebody with, a family and 2 children and so on, making a decision for a secure life within the private sector rather than continuing in kind of fringe academic research or whatever. I mean, for you as a young scientist, do you have any feelings about kind of the like, I don't know, the ethics of where jobs take you and what Andy had decided to do?
I don't know. I guess I can't really speak for Andy, but I don't know what. So he's like a molecular scientist. Well, he's a chemist, isn't he? Something that confused me is like, in terms of his like wide like level of discipline, like he's a molecular chemist, and then he can also like create and engineer this specific bacteria, like that's very like biology. And then, so spoilers everyone, Carl kills himself at the end because he's like a martyrdom, which we're going to discuss a bit, towards the movement. He's like, it's a worthy thing to die for. But Carl basically says, right, Andy, off you go. You've got all the knowledge to basically lead humanity out of this and create a better world. Well, how's Andy got all of this knowledge? Like, how's Andy just like omnipotent? No, like, he knows everything. He knows all the climate science, all the biology, all the renewable energy. Like, he's gonna lead us. He's gonna tell everyone what to be doing. Yeah, I don't know.
I suppose if his doctoral studies had sort of implemented skill sets across biology and chemistry, it's potentially true. Or maybe he and Carl as a team had those respective specialisms. But I do take your point completely. And we can perhaps come on to this idea of, actually it's probably worth doing now, the idea that what you need is like this, like there's somebody coming to save us, there's like a hero narrative. And I was thinking about this particularly with this book that came out this year, or I think this year, or end of last year, called It's Not That Radical by Michaela Loach. Really recommend it. It's all about the idea of kind of climate activism, but a lot about intersectionality and so on. And she writes, we must resist these individual hero narratives because they are false. For any action or change to happen, the work of thousands of ordinary people is going on behind the scenes. And she links this idea of kind of the individual hero change coming from these kind of people who have particular special skills, who lead the fight for change, or who will do something revolutionary. And she says, that this is a product of neoliberal ideology, which we've talked about on the last couple of episodes. So on the one hand, like, Carl seems to see himself as this sort of individual hero, and that leads to his martyrdom. He sees Andy as kind of carrying on that baton. But I was quite reassured that sort of the end of the show was more like, in a time of catastrophe, like, the world's communities can come together and communally bring about change. It just needed something to catalyze that.
Yeah, I guess it's like driving, like at the end of the day, it feels like the takeaway message is, well, not to get takeaway message, but being like, in terms of like humanity's gonna overcome, like, is gonna continue going on. Is just like obviously for us to prioritize renewable energy, there's got to be no other choice, which is a shame that it is kind of like that, but it clearly seems, no one's going to be willing to pick planet over profit or whatever. It's going to be like, this is the most
So what do you
profitable
think are the
way.
ways that could be brought about? Because obviously Gaslight offers us one option, which is the eco-terrorist extreme option, which even Laura, who is obviously won over by some of Carl's arguments, she's a young climate protester and activist, doing a lot of kind of messaging online and through kind of video platforms and things like that. But she's relatively convinced until the end, where she's basically like, you cannot justify the level of harm and death that you're causing to bring about change. And I suppose this is the great question. When does kind of violent action, when is it required? When does it work? How critical are we left feeling of what Carl does? Like, how much of a villain is the villain? I don't know. What did you think it was trying to say about that? And did you agree?
Yeah, I guess again it's kind of very, very much like utilitarian perspective for him. It's like, oh, I'm going to sacrifice, a couple thousand people for like, the greater lives of millions, basically. I don't know. I feel like, people, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like there's a general consensus that like for real change should be brought about, like there needs to be some form of like violent protest, otherwise there's not going to really take place any sort of like change. I don't know. It's difficult. Like, I mean, it's easy for me to say this from my like little fishy sofa and be like, yes, down with it all. But yeah, I don't know. I think what the show does really well is kind of play on like the fears, like like public fears around like just stop oil and Extinction Rebellion and stuff. And like play into that like, oh, they're too radical sort of narrative. So
Yeah, I mean, I was really reading up on this because there's been a lot of discussion about the effectiveness or not of disruptive protest and climate activism of different sorts and what effect they have. And I'll put some links in the show notes, but there was an interesting article in the Guardian that looked at this. This is from about a year ago now, but I think most of it still applies. That there's this difference between public perception and actual change caused by disruptive protest. So a lot of people will say that climate activists cause chaos for hardworking people, but I think there was a statistic that said 78% of Britons think that disruptive protest hinders activists' causes. And we're talking about the things that you were just talking about, blocking motorways and hindering access to airports, but also stuff like targeting sporting and cultural events and throwing soup on paintings and things like that. So some of those things that don't necessarily hinder hardworking people, but are considered an attack on kind of culture. So on the one hand, there's this idea about public perception and people thinking it's hindering the goals of climate activists versus the sort of research and perspectives undertaken by social scientists and experts who study social movements, who actually say it's really contradictory. And they argue that strategic disruption is not only an effective tactic, but it's also the most important tactical factor for a social movement success. So actually, when you start to look at the kind of long-term process of social change, then it is these kinds of radical actions, which, as we know, certainly under the last government, were given lengthy criminal sentences, these 5-year sentences for the action on the M25.
I didn't even realize, did that action even go through? Because I thought I heard it from other places that those people got imprisoned for just like joining a Zoom call to like talk about like action.
So
what actually happened?
You are right that it was the the planning behind the
So they didn't even do anything.
so they were convicted of conspiracy to commit public nuisance, and of course within the context of the wider crackdown on the right to protest, in the light of the Just Stop Oil protesters who were had scaled the Dartford crossing. These I suppose it's within that sort of setting that that these things were done. Now, there's been some arguments, I think, to say that what they were doing was far more kind of like widespread in terms of its conspiracy, but it does seem extremely heavy-handed, and I think it will be interesting to see whether the laws around protest and public offence will be changed under a Starmer-led government. But yeah, I mean, so we've got the sort of the legal situation, but there's also, I think it's interesting when we look at obviously sort of the most successful social justice movements, we have to see that their success, whilst not necessarily predicated on violent acts, certainly was highly disruptive. So if we think about the Black Civil Rights Movement, if we think about the movement for universal suffrage, these things did disrupt society in a big way, and they did achieve their goals, and we no longer question that. I mean, overthrowing apartheid, a very violent situation in order to achieve that end. And so, if you're trying to shut down an entire industry, can you do that, without disruptive behavior? But there was another, I think, interesting side to it. And again, I'll put a link to an article in piece of research for nature.com. And that is pointing out that what you need to do is prioritize targets that are institutional and are power centered. So although you'll get lots of publicity, which is good for other kinds of activism, if it's not actually harming the people who both profit the most from the fossil fuels industry and who have the power to make legislation to control financial investment, those have to be the targets. And again, that perhaps correlates a bit with this criticism of attacking the sort of hardworking people. So I mean, I don't know, where do you think that, obviously, like, this is the most extreme version, the one that skips over the sort of targeting of law change and things like that. It just stops oil quite literally. Did you feel that there's like, where's the justification point? Is there where's the line for you on what, I suppose, between like activism and terrorism or something?
I don't know, it's such a hard thing to define, especially in the context of it. Well, in this universe is fictional, so it's easy to me to be like, oh, I think it's okay, but I don't know. It's also hard because I feel like obviously whenever people are like, oh, terrorists, it's always like painted as like what they're specifically like, whatever the terrorism is happening for is painted as like bad anyway.
Absolutely. Well, we'll say one person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter, and so on. So,
exactly. So it's just, I don't know, it's kind of hard to define because I very much believe climate change is a bad thing. Yes, heard it here first. But so it's just kind of like, do the ends justify the means? Probably, but it's also all fictional. I know.
I suppose that one of the questions that I would raise is this idea that, yes, okay, so we've got the short-term deaths, we've got assassinations within the industry, not necessarily of people with any kind of power within it, but sort of within the lab, so that they can't figure out and stop what has been done. We've got the impact of people whose planes fall out of the sky, and we've got the impact on people who are on life support and require hospitals to have power and things like that. So all of these people are impacted, but what we don't necessarily see discussed that much is the longer term impact, which is that the people who will be impacted the worst are going to be the sick and the elderly if they can't heat their homes, people who don't have the money to make immediate investment into alternatives, which of course in a very much a sort of seller's market. If you're marketing something that is solar powered and will heat the house, well, suddenly that's going to go through the roof in terms of price. Countries in the global south, for example, which tend to be far worse hit by these things. There's a lot there in terms of the knock-on effects and the number of people who will die as a consequence. But you could also
Yeah,
say,
that's true.
well, that's true of the climate
That's
crisis as
true.
well, and if we don't
Climate
stop
change.
it, the same people will be impacted. So
Yeah, I guess like I like the other question is like if this is like one extreme and then
mm,
there's like the other. So like where do you find what's the middle point? Like
mm,
where what would you suggest as like a tactic where it's just affecting the people at the
mhm,
top,
yeah.
like these oil tycoons or
Mm.
whatever. Like how do you like especially in the level like I think the difference between the climate terrorists in the show and like obviously, well, I mean, lots of huge differences, but also, the organizations that we have, like activist organizations that we have in real life, is like the level of like funding and organization and how like I don't know how put
Mm.
together the groups are because like what are the activists like the terrorists called in the show in Last Light? I don't know. They're like on a whole different level.
Yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
very valid, and it's a very good question about how do you target these things. I mean, obviously, I would really like to see a move towards more legal restriction on things like private planes. I mean, that would be a really obvious one. Now, the trouble with it is that that sort of thing is done on a nation by nation basis. So how do you make a real impact? You say, well,
Yeah.
we won't allow private planes in the UK, but if they allow them to fly into Ireland, for example,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
there are issues there, but I do think the legislation, proper taxation on companies that don't move towards decarbonisation, wealth taxes, and very serious kind of taxation in terms of impact of measures to avoid just people
Yeah.
greenwashing, because I think that's a
Like
very big
these. So
problem.
I think like these all good points about how does like these like all like legal changes
Yeah,
that need to
how do
be done
yeah,
by a
yeah,
government body rather than
exactly.
something that like
So how do you
activists
get the
can do
democracy?
directly.
Yeah.
Like yeah, exactly. I don't know. It's
Well, I
just
suppose one
yeah.
of the things would be to have literally better public education. And I'm not convinced, given the I suppose this is where this thing about kind of public perception for me does come in, because public perception impacts people's decisions in the ballot box, and that impacts,
Mm.
what policies a government will bring in. There is a really good book which I haven't finished reading yet, but I'll mention it now, called "Not the End of the World" by Hannah Ritchie, which I would really recommend to everybody who's looking for something that gives a really strong sense of what can realistically be done within a generation to make sorry, that's the dog licking the microphone, to make actual change, and sort of saying, look at how fast we have caused a change already in our planet, both in the positive in terms of reducing world poverty, increasing education and medical access, and so on, but also how fast we have caused the massive leap in carbon emissions that have led to the climate crisis, and essentially sort
Yeah.
of saying, there is the opportunity now to make a change within a generation, and we have got the technologies to do that, and it comes down to the way we eat, the way that we use land, the way in which so, for example, we tackle plastic pollution. Well, plastic pollution now mostly comes from lower middle income countries. And so rich countries have a responsibility to help those other countries to make recycling and proper landfill centres, a priority, and things like that. So these are the things that can be done with sort of reasonable targets. Now, behind all of this, of course, is decarbonisation, but it's a very good look at the data as things stand, and a very kind of practical guide. But you are right. How do you change that public perception?
I feel like a lot of the sort of what we eat, or, you know, how we recycle, like it's very on like the individualist sort of level of like, you know, personal responsibility, where there's also like on the flip side, it's like I'm not personally like pumping out those
No.
like, you know, CO2 out into the atmosphere. And
Well,
I
you
don't
just
know
got to
like
get rid of
how
your
much.
private jet, Marsha, and then
Ah, I know, guys. Oh, I was about to take it to work later after this, so yeah, might be a bit of trouble. But yeah, I also I'm not sure. Like, I obviously think those things are important. I try and like eat like vegetarian myself, which don't quote me on this, but fun fact for the listeners here, if this inspires you, a friend of mine said that she did some maths, and apparently eating vegan for 1 week every month is the equivalent of being vegetarian for a year in terms of like carbon
that
emissions.
figures.
So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
if people, you know, want to sort of reduce their meat
I think it's
consumption
one of
in
the
an
things that
impactful
an
way.
individual can really make a difference on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, but also how much of it is like part of the, you know, your personal carbon footprint, how much of that has been like pushed by these
Of
like
course. Yeah.
companies
Companies say that it
to be
puts the
like, yeah,
responsibility onto individuals. No, I think that's absolutely true.
yeah,
But I suppose in terms of a social change, it's like if more individuals become flexitarian, for example. So not even making like a complete commitment to becoming a
yeah,
vegetarian or vegan, you suddenly start a conversation that basically says, look, this is what I do, this is the food I eat. People start serving it more to in cafes, they start stocking more of that in supermarkets. It normalizes it, and
yeah,
it no longer becomes something that's kind of weird or on the edge, like saying I no longer fly, or I only I now limit my flight allowance to one flight a year or something. All of those things, you start talking about it, you start to create societal change. So I suppose in that way, you can feel completely hopeless as an individual, and you shouldn't be responsible unless you are, Taylor Swift or somebody. Then I think there is a social change that happens when people start accepting things as normal. That would make a really big difference. But yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I
And
think it's a very challenging question, and I think Last Light is interesting because it sort of says what Carl's group does is wrong, but it achieves the right outcome. So is it
yeah,
therefore actually wrong?
yeah,
It's quite
it's a bit
bold
of a
for
head
doing that.
scratcher, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like, to go back a little bit to what you're saying about getting sort of this like democratic way
Mm,
to change, but like, and also like educating people. I don't know. I feel like there's a bit of like everyone talks about this like movement around like
yeah.
anti-intellectualism like recently, but I was watching a video by, and I'm gonna butcher this, but Alain de
Yes,
Botton.
yes, you're right. Yeah, Alain de Botton.
He's great. I'm loving him at the moment. But he like, I watched one of his talks on like media and stuff, and talking about how, you know, like in democracy, people's like decisions, like how am I going to try and describe this? Basically, to convince people that like an issue is important, you know, showing them a picture, a depressing photograph of like an iceberg that's melting with like a polar bear on it, it's not going to bring people in. Like, no one's like, people aren't going to be wanting to
That'll
read
do
about
me
that. They'd
every
rather
time.
be
Every
like,
sad polar bear. There's like, one less
yeah,
cheese I'm going to eat to reduce my dairy or whatever.
but he was sort of talking about this concept of like, to convince people of like these issues, you also have to like, yeah, you have to like bring in like a popular kind of, he was kind of giving this example of like the polar bear and the iceberg, but then somehow tying it to like Taylor Swift's outfits this weekend or whatever, and like, and he was sort of saying, and this is like, with even with like Kamala Harris's campaign, she's like taken on this like the current cultural zeitgeist is like Brat and Charlie XCX's album. Very good. If no one's to it yet, I recommend. But to like to bring in those people, like she's having to take on this branding to like make her movement more popular, and therefore convince people, like,
Mhm.
you're not going to convince them to vote for you by just being like, these are the issues at hand, this
Mhm.
is why it's important. No one's going to care.
Yeah.
And this is, he was kind of saying, Elaine was saying, this is like part of the issues of like democracy and
Mhm.
stuff. you know, it's not always, I mean, obviously, you know,
No, you're
like
right.
there's
I mean,
pros
I
and
think
cons in
that,
all systems, but it's one of the reasons that it's not always
yeah.
like it's not 100% great. Yeah, because of how like the public's attention span kind of like sways
Mm,
what we really care about reading
yeah,
and
I think that's
become like
probably
being
really
informed about.
true. I think there's also been a real problem with this idea that you know, everybody's opinion is equally valid. So, you know,
Hmm.
for
Like
every
free
climate,
speech and
yeah,
everything,
every
yeah.
climate change scientist we have on, we also have to have, you know, a climate denier. And, you know, you only have to listen. Oh, I haven't listened to it because life is too short, but I have heard quite a lot about the interview between Trump and Musk on
I haven't.
X.
I've heard about it, but I haven't actually.
No,
Yeah,
I
informed
can't.
myself
No,
yet.
no,
Just don't have the
no.
time.
But
I'm bored. Yeah.
the sort of snippets that I've heard, I mean, the unhinged. I mean, it is unhinged talk about the climate crisis, and I think that, you know, if you've got anybody who is, you know, leading in society, whether as a potential president or as, you know, somebody of extreme wealth and influence,
Well, also,
disseminating those
it
ideas, it's
undermines like the whole entire like, you know, Elon Musk, his like main, like, he's got loads of things going on for him, but he like produces electric
yep,
cars. Like, isn't
yeah,
the
you
whole
know,
entire point
Tesla
to be like,
were
this is
the first and
better?
the greatest,
Yeah, to
but
drive the like move to more, I don't know, like
I think
less
it's because
carbon emission sort of
it's just about profit
thing.
rather than
Oh,
about
yeah,
the
100%. But
ideal.
I was like reading an article saying how, not to like get into the whole Elon Musk thing, but like his like sort of turn to these like radical right
Mm,
politics are actually driving away a lot of his
mm.
like consumers of his like
Yeah,
products, and
absolutely.
people are
When I
like,
first got an electric car, my first choice would have been to get a Tesla. Now, I didn't in the end, largely because of the cost, because they're so much more
yeah,
expensive. Now, I wouldn't even touch a Tesla.
yeah,
I don't have a
yeah.
car at all at the moment, and I kind of hope to keep it that way. But you know, if I did go back to having an EV, then I wouldn't go there. So yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, I think the other thing that I felt that Last Light didn't really look at was mitigation. So I think a lot of what we need to be doing in terms of climate justice is also to accept that we need to mitigate against the hard to reverse or irreversible effects of temperature rise as it currently
Mm.
stands. And so, and this is something that the Trump thing made me talk about. He said rising sea levels would mean more waterfront properties. Just like unbelievable. But you know, this idea that basically there are parts of the world where people are going to be more dramatically affected. Just like, you know, the show doesn't obviously look at that so much, but it does look at the impact on the people who are in the hospital where Sam is, and I suppose Sam as a disabled person, albeit one with a lot of support and wealth around him. It does look at the
He owns a
he
horse.
does own a horse, that is
He
true.
owns a horse. Anyway, sorry, continue.
The and like the very supportive immigrant population that essentially looks at, you know, whether we really want to be looking to I guess this idea about how we look at the global population, and this kind of positive idea around needing to change our idea of kind of like strong nationalistic kind of borders and so on, which we were talking about at the beginning. But all of that, I guess, is kind of still there, but in a different way. So we've got, you know, instead of just people being impacted by the effects of the climate emergency, we've also got people being impacted by the end of fossil fuels, because there's going to be a transition period where everything is shit for everybody, like because of the global temperature and because of lack of fossil fuels, and there's nothing in place to really kind of look at the sort of mitigation of that. And much as we need strategies to change the future in terms of decarbonisation, we also need strategies to accept that the future is going to be really harmful, and we need to completely radically change our attitudes to, you know, house building and farming and things like that. So I don't think Carl has thought about that, but that's probably why he throws himself off a cliff at the end,
so
in his sort of arms wide Jesus on the cross moment.
yes,
Yeah.
this is I was again also talking to my partner about it, but he was like, oh, do you think it's kind of like a biblical reference in him sort of, like we're sort of seeing like maybe like the whole entire oil, like him dying for like to get rid of oil or whatever. It's like sound like Jesus dying for our sins, or maybe oil's like
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very like, well, they keep talking about it's a cause worth dying for.
Yes,
like,
yeah. And I guess, again, causes worth dying for, we only have to look at the impact of the death of Martin Luther King, for example, and the way in which, okay, there were many people in the Black Civil Rights movement, but he is probably the one that everyone can name, and yes, a great speaker and a great leader, and so on, but also, of course, the one who was killed for his cause, and that, I think, makes a real difference to the way these things are viewed, which is why it is in fact better that the assassination of Trump failed rather than succeeded, I think. But okay, so some interesting sort of ideas there. Takeaway message for you, other than do not watch this show, it is a waste of life.
No, it's interesting. If you need a little sort of like mind sort of scratcher, I would recommend, because it might be for you, maybe it just wasn't my thing, but I'd say main takeaway is, I don't know, I guess like something about radical action.
Yeah.
Like I had how about what's your main takeaway, Claire, and I'll come back to you on mine in a sec.
Yeah, I suppose my main takeaway is probably that we need to look very hard at having created a situation where that genuinely feels like a valid solution, however horrific we may find it, and however sort of disproportionately impactful upon the vulnerable and so on. It's presented as the way of change. So we've got to find a way to bring that about, an actual end to fossil fuels that doesn't disproportionately target those people, I suppose. That's the thing. Now, you're quite right that then we're left questioning, what it is that should be done. We see Laura, protesting, and the sort of person that she needs to be able to impact is somebody like her own father, who doesn't take her seriously. And so, I think there is a real question there, who are we speaking to in those kinds of protests? So maybe listeners should send us their brilliant ideas for action and transformation. So we are going to do Gattaca for our next watch, a classic film of the genre. Have you seen it, Masha?
I haven't seen it. No,
it's good. It's one of the greats that were raised particular questions around meritocracy and societal structure and excellence and things like that.
I've actually been listening to a lot of Alan Duton talking about meritocracy.
Well, there you go. Yes,
it's great, perfect timing.
So that's the next episode, which will be released 2 weeks after this one. And in the meantime, you can fill your alternate weeks with our newsletter, which you can subscribe to on Substack. And you can follow us on Instagram at Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs, and let us know whether you had any thoughts about Last Light. We'd love to hear from our listeners. So, are we happy?
Yeah, very
excellent.
Happy.
Thank you very much, Marsha, and thank you very much, lovely listeners.